Okay. Well, I'm going to give you a an overview of some of the recent research, and I have to say right from the very beginning that this is um, this is a very slim sample because there's so much research that it's impossible to really know um, what everything that's out there. But I'll do my very best to kind of point you into the right direction so that if you want to find some resources, you can find some resources. Um, so the first thing that I'm going to do is keep letting these people in. So I'm going to point you to this. So there are currently that we know of, and this is actually probably an underestimate. There are currently about 14 or so meta-analyses that have been done. So I want to just show you one thing that we put together. So we put together a diamond approach treatment manual, and in that treatment manual, and I can send this to people if you want to send me an email. But in that, we put in here a bunch of stuff about the evidence base of solution-focused brief therapy. And the evidence base, so we tried to list all of the meta-analyses. And again, this was first published in November of 2023. So there have been some done in the end of 2023, some done in the beginning of 24 that haven't been captured here. But I want to just walk through a couple of these things so that you know when you get it, what to look for. So the first thing I want to say about a meta-analysis is what it is. A meta-analysis takes a bunch of research and pulls all of the findings together, and then it looks at what do the overall findings of all of these studies mean together. And so you can see here, we tried to create this table that that shows what year the meta-analysis was done, and then what population it was done on. So usually these meta-analyses, they're done with specific populations. So you can see like this first one was done looking at behavior change within adults. You can see if I go down elementary students in Korea, you can see, and there are several. So we tried to list as many as we could here. Group therapy for Chinese children, medical settings, right? Children and adolescents. So you can see all of the different places that solution-focused brief therapy is being done in the different countries, those kinds of things. This last column here, that is where we have the findings. So what do the findings say? Now, you can see here that some of them, like this one here, has multiple findings. It's what did they find when they were looking at what impact does it have on self-esteem? What impact does it have on school adjustment? What impact does it have on interpersonal relationships? And what impact does it have on self-efficacy? So that particular meta-analysis was looking at multiple different things. So we tried to capture the findings from all of those things. So you can see it, and that goes on. Now, the other thing I want to point your attention to is these stars. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about when you get down to the bottom, there's a small effect, a medium effect, or a large effect. And what that means is when solution-focused brief therapy is compared to some other thing, sometimes it's treatment as usual, sometimes it's a different therapeutic approach like CBT or narrative therapy or something like that. And it says, does it make a difference? Does solution-focused brief therapy show a stronger significance than the other compared results? And anything 1, 2, or 3 stars, it shows that there are indeed solution-focused brief therapy comes out on top. So anytime you see 1 star, 2 stars, or 3 stars, it means that solution-focused brief therapy performed better. Now, small means slightly better, medium means a bit better than that, and large means it's significantly bigger than that. So any of these 3 stars, you can see it made a big difference in these studies. So why does that matter? It matters because in essence now we can say solution-focused brief therapy is working in all of these different settings and it's working better than other approaches or the treatment as usual or whatever. So you can see there's now this big pile of research out there that's saying solution-focused brief therapy is working and it's working quite well. The other thing I want to highlight from this document, and then I'll go back to the PowerPoint, is down here. And we just took a sample. We said, so where is research being done that's showing support for solution-focused brief therapy? And so we listed a bunch of different countries, and there are probably more that we don't know about, which I'm going to get to. But you can see all of these different countries or cultures, and then studies that have been done to show that solution-focused brief therapy is working with populations within those countries or cultures. So again, this is just a sample, but it gives you a good beginning to say solution-focused brief therapy. There's a lot of evidence out there that shows that solution-focused brief therapy is effective. So again, that is all found in the new Diamond Treatment Manual, and you can capture that there. So I just want to begin there and say, there's 14 meta-analyses now done from all over the world. There is research done in various countries showing that this works, that it's helpful, and that it's producing positive outcomes. The next thing I want to do is I just want to, again, when they asked me to do this, they said, can you just give an overview of recent research? And I think this study here gives a really good indication of where research is being done and what they're finding. Bayabach and his colleagues, Bayabach's in Spain, they did a recent study that was published in 2021. And you'll hear most of the research that I'm going to cite comes from 2021, 2022, 2023. It's hard to find research being published yet in 2024, but that's all coming. So we usually lag a couple of years behind. But they did this study, in essence, that said, we want to know where research, solution-focused research is being done. And they compared the different studies, all of the research that they could find. And they found a series of studies, and they said they looked at what they called weird countries versus non-weird countries. And weird stands for westernized, educated, industrialized. Now I forgot what the R stands for, but
rich.
Anyway, rich. You are right. Thank you, Rachel. Yes. Anyway, these countries are the typical countries that are like the United States and a lot of the European countries, these westernized countries where research is destined to come from because there's a strong university presence. There's a strong incentive for people in these countries to produce research, to conduct research. And then they also said that a lot of this research is being done in these non-westernized countries, non-educated countries. But one of the things that's really, really important is that the research came from 5 of the 6 inhabitable countries or continents. But you look here at this second bullet, and one of the things that's really important is that 190 of the studies came from these non-weird countries, which is actually more than 50%. So more than 50% of the current solution-focused research that we can find and that we know about is coming from non-westernized countries. And this is actually a really good thing for the base of solution-focused research, because what this means is that we're now starting to see, does this apply in countries where it's not been established for a really long time? There's been tons of studies that have been done here in the States and in Australia and in Europe that say, we know that solution focus works, but we don't know if it works in a lot of other parts of the world. And now, just recently, we have passed over where more of the research is being done in these non-westernized countries. So where it's being done really recently, you can see a huge amount is coming out of Asia. China, Iran, Turkey, and South Korea are huge contributors now to the solution-focused research. You can see only now about 28% is coming from the European continent, with UK, Finland, Netherlands, and Lithuania being the countries that seem to be producing the most. From the Americas, only about 20% of the studies now. The US and Canada, and you can see in Oceania, you got about 4%, and from Africa now, just a small portion, but it is growing. 75%. So now this is where it gets really interesting. 75% of the studies came from 8 countries. 5 of them are weird countries and 3 of them are non-weird countries. Again, China, Iran, and Turkey are huge contributors now to the solution-focused literature that's coming out. What's also interesting is that only 17 of the studies were conducted by authors from the other studies, or from the other countries. So you're looking at quite a breadth of research, but it's still being done by a collective group of people. And that makes a lot of sense in some sense, right? People who are associated with universities tend to produce research. Most of the solution-focused population is connected to universities. It's connected to places where research can get funded. And so one of the things that I would say right off the top is that we need to try to collaborate much more around the globe to show where solution-focused brief therapy can be done outside of where we already know it's being done. So this is a study that kind of captures, we are making a lot of headway in the solution-focused research world, but we want to continue to grow that because we want to know, is it different? Is it working differently in different places? And I'll show a little bit about that as well. Here, then, I just want to highlight another article. This is a scoping review of the literature that was published just in the year 2022. And this study was kind of commissioned a bit by the European Brief Therapy Association. And they were looking at, in essence, they looked at every article they could find, every solution-focused article that was published in the year 2022. So we could kind of get a snapshot of what's happening. I'm guessing they'll do something similar for the 2023 literature, but oftentimes it takes a bit of time for it to kind of be readily available. So that's why we're going back to 2022. You can see here that, again, most of the studies were conducted in a small subset of countries, with Asia being the highest contributor to the solution-focused literature in 2022, followed by the US, and then Europe, and then Africa, and then South America. And one of the things that this indicates is that some parts of the world it's really growing. Some of the places in the world, research is really starting to be prolific, whereas in other places, it's actually starting to decline. In Europe, Europe used to be one of the major contributors to solution-focused literature, and in 2022, it declined quite a bit. Only 5 studies came out of Europe. Again, then you look at what kinds of studies they were. Huge portion were in educational settings. So this is now outside of clinical settings, whereas medical or healthcare settings are also hugely popular. And you only get 7 of the studies that are coming in counseling settings now. So you think about that historically, and we even call it solution-focused brief therapy. And now most of the research studies that are being done are not in therapeutic settings. They're in educational settings, or they're in medical settings, or they're in outpatient settings. And so that, to me, says we might need to broaden, or we might need to begin to talk about what are the similarities between solution-focused brief therapy versus solution-focused practice in other settings. Are there things that are different or not? Because again, most of the research is coming from outside of clinical therapeutic settings. You can see then the distribution, about 67, 2/3 of the population were with adults. Whereas then there were some with adolescents, some kids. Half of the studies, I think this is also really interesting, half of the studies only included female samples. So you think about that, half of the research that was done on solution-focused brief therapy in a given year only included females. On the one hand, that's great because we need to know quite a bit. Oftentimes, women are underrepresented in research. So in some sense, this is a great thing. But in another sense, we don't we don't know what then that means for men, because in most of the other studies, they included both men and women. So you're getting about now close to 75% of our sample is women, and about 25% of our sample is with men. Again, historically, that's probably a good thing, because historically men were overrepresented in research. But again, it makes us wonder, why now is there such a shift to female participants being present there? In addition, one of the things that these authors highlighted is that ethnicity, education, relationship status, they were oftentimes not reported on. So we don't know, even though it's now we're kind of getting a diverse sampling of research from all these different countries, we don't know much about who these people are. What are their contextual factors that may impact how they engage in this process, what this process means for them? And so one of the things that they recommended is that going forward, understanding these different variables, talking about these different variables might make a big difference. Now, I want to be really clear here is that a lot of times clinicians say, we don't need to even know these variables. This is an individualistic approach, right? I'm just doing this with the person who's sitting here. I'm waiting for their words. I don't necessarily need to know what their ethnicity is or what their education level is or those kinds of things. And on the one hand, as a practitioner, I can understand that and I can value that. On the other hand, we don't know very much about if we do know those things, or if we do take those things into consideration, do our questions come across differently? Are they heard in a different way? Can people respond to them in a different way? So there is a clinical implication of this, and there's also a research implication. If we're trying to compare our literature and our research to other approaches and other people's literature, they regularly attend to these things. So they'll say things like, we know that CBT works with African American men, or we know that CBT works with lesbians from India, or whatever it might be, right? And we have a very hard time responding, saying, yes, we know that ours works as well with those populations, because we don't do a very good job of collecting this information as we do the research. So that's a limitation here. There are lots of things about our research that's great, that's worthwhile, but there are some limitations and things that we can attend to in order to make our research a bit more robust. Continuing on with this, I'll just really quickly go over this, but they talk about like how many of the studies are quantitative versus qualitative versus mixed methods. You can see most are quantitative studies, which is very typical in psychotherapy literature and research. Most are quasi-experimental, experimental, or randomized controlled trials. Randomized controlled trials are kind of what they call the gold standard in research. It's the highest quality of research that we can usually get. You can see here 8 of the studies that were published were case studies. In overall literature, these are useful because we get understanding of individual cases. But when you evaluate the usefulness or the generalizability, case studies are actually quite low. So to have 13% of the given research in a year be dedicated to case studies, that's probably a larger proportion than you would see in other therapeutic approaches. So again, a bit of a limitation because our research is really honing in on each individual. That makes sense given our approach. We're regularly looking for how does this help each individual? How do we customize this for each individual? But as far as research goes, that's not always the most effective kind of research. You can see over here on the right side, almost 50% of the studies were done when the intervention or solution-focused therapy was given in a group format. So again, this is unusual, but you can see, much of this literature is coming from China and from Iran, and a bulk of those studies are done in group format. So it just will inform when you say solution-focused brief therapy is effective, you might need to think about, was this delivered in a group? Was this delivered to an individual? Was this delivered in couples? You can see only about 25% were done in an individual format. Again, that makes sense because a lot of the literature that we're considering wasn't done in counseling or therapeutic settings. So if somebody were going to the hospital and let's say they were having like kidney failure or something like that, solution-focused therapy might be given to a bunch of people, a group of people who are all dealing with kidney failure. And so it's efficacious as far as time, as far as finances and those kinds of things. And so medical settings might be more prone to offer this intervention in a group setting. So again, as you weigh the research, you want to take into consideration how was it delivered, because that'll inform what we can draw from it. Again, you can see about 58% of the studies said that they used pure SFBT, so they didn't mix it with anything else. Whereas solution-focused brief therapy in about 30% was combined with treatment as usual, and oftentimes that was either psychoeducation or CBT. So it's hard to, again, know were the impacts for these 30%-ish, was the impact of the intervention, was that due to the solution focus part, or was that due to the other part? And so again, it's a bit to have 1/3 of the studies be designed like that. We want to be really careful about how we talk about the effectiveness of solution-focused brief therapy. There's lots that say that it's effective, but we might have a question to say, well, what is effective about it? Was it the psychoeducation? Was it the solution-focused therapy? It's hard to know in some of these studies. The next part there says, how long did it take? Only about 70% of the articles even mentioned how many sessions they provided, which again, I think is an important thing. We don't know if they got 1 session or if they got 100 sessions. So that's something that if you're ever going to do research, you really want to comment on what did the protocol look like and how many sessions did you give? In the 70% that did report, the average number of sessions was about 6.5. But it ranged, you can see there was a big range from 1 to 29. In one study, they were given 29 sessions worth of therapy. And so again, that big range indicates that in most of the studies, there was a short time period in order to get an average of 6. Then to compensate for that one that was at 29, you would have to have a lot of studies that were less than that in order to pull the average back down to 6. So that's what a snapshot of 2022 looks like. That's where we kind of sit. And just in a second, I'll open it up for some questions, but there's just a little bit more about this scoping review. They included 11 studies that focused on the client's experience or what the process of solution-focused brief therapy was. And a couple of things came out. All of these 11 indicated that it was helpful, that it was positive, that it was useful, that there were benefits. So in all of these studies, they said, yep, it was really helpful to me. In addition, they said there were 2 things that kind of stood out as particularly helpful: the best hopes question and exploring what worked. Those 2 things, people in those studies highlighted, that's actually the thing, or those were the things that kind of pushed me over the top, that said, this was really helpful for me. The miracle question, on the other hand, caused some difficulty for people. People mentioned that they were a bit confused. People mentioned that it was hard for them to answer that question. And so the reviewers of this literature kind of said, we might need to use this question with caution, which is interesting because this oftentimes is held as one of the hallmarks of solution-focused therapy. And in addition to that, when they do solution-focused research, oftentimes they say you have to ask the miracle question in order for it to be considered a solution-focused session. We want to see that in order to count it as solution-focused. So that enters into a realm of, are we doing research to answer particular questions and we're forcing people into answering the miracle question? Or are we letting them say, these are things that are helpful to me, and we reorient our work in order to be helpful to them? So that's a bit of a rub between research and clinical practice that I think we can learn something from. Perhaps we don't need to be so rigid with saying you have to do this. And so I think that's important, especially as you think about, again, more than 50% of this literature is coming from Asian countries. And there may be something particular about the miracle question that's inconsistent with those cultures. In addition, the solution focused, when you use solution focused questions compared to problem focused questions, they were associated with improvement on the measurement outcomes. So if you gave somebody problem focused questions, their outcomes tended to fall. They said, it didn't help me as much, it wasn't as good, which makes sense, I think, to all of us as solution focused practitioners. They also then included in this study one study that was a microanalysis study that looked at presuppositions across time and solution-focused practice. And they included one study that was a review of the solution building skill development. So that's kind of like, it captures the 2022 literature that exists. I know that was like a whirlwind. I have some other things that I want to point you to, but I want to just pause for a second and say, do you have any questions? Because I just like fire hosed you with a lot of information. Yeah, Joe, go ahead.
For the education research, do you have any, is it itemized? Is it broken down versus secondary versus elementary versus groups versus teaching versus could you say more about that?
I can point you to the original article at the end of the PowerPoint. If you want to email me, I can email you the PowerPoint. At the end of the PowerPoint, the reference is there, and you can find it. This article was published in the Journal of Solution Focused Practice, so it's an open access journal. You can get it. And they list every article that they included as part of this scoping review. So you can kind of get access to all of them and see they didn't particularly say, they didn't break it down into those different grade levels or those kinds of things. They just took it collectively and said, this is where it was coming from. So to get
Cool.
more nuanced, you would probably have to look at those articles.
Cool. Thank you.
You bet. Any other questions so far?
No.
Yeah, Rachel.
Thanks, Adam. That's really, really useful and a lot of work. What do you think it is about the miracle question that people are really struggling with? Is it because obviously there's different ways of using a miracle question, there's different ways of presenting a miracle question. I presume we don't know a great deal about which approach they've used in those papers. I just wondered what your thoughts were on that, if you had any yet.
I think I do have a couple of thoughts. I think one, oftentimes the miracle question is given in a very like repetitious, robotic way.
Mm.
And I think sometimes, and this is my own feeling, this is not what the researchers said at all, but I think sometimes when we ask it in that way, then in a minute, I'm going to talk about the process research. And one of the things that the process research highlighted that was really, really effective is that a co-construction and maintaining the client's language. And I think sometimes the miracle question gets so repetitious that it's just like, suppose all the things that brought you here are fixed tomorrow, what would you notice? It removes all of the nuance. It removes all of the things that help the client to feel heard, to feel validated. And so I think we have to be really careful about how we ask it. We need to, again, the process research really highlights we need to co-construct this, which means their words need to show up in it. So I think that's one thing. But I think a lot of these things, especially in China, a lot of the people that I have talked to about that, they say miracles aren't so much, they don't really hold the same value. It means something entirely different in China than it does elsewhere. And so again, knowing how much of this research is coming out of China, it may be that they're trying to apply something to their culture that doesn't fit for them. And so figuring out what are we really trying to get at when we ask the miracle question, and is there a more culturally appropriate way to get at the same thing without using that particular language? So I think both of those things might contribute.
I think, yeah, I can see quite a few people sort of nodding along as well to that, and the idea of miracle, and also using the client's language. I think you're right, and maybe perhaps there's more of a rigid application of the miracle question, which isn't meeting the client's needs.
Yeah, and I think that thought has implications no matter where we are, right? Again, if most of our research isn't asking about culture and ethnicity and those kinds of things, do we know that the person who's sitting in front of us is going to benefit from that kind of a question or not? Perhaps we need to, through our questioning, get to know someone well enough to know, how do I ask them something that's really relevant to them?
Interesting.
Yeah. Anything else so far? Okay, I'm going to keep going. If you have questions, I'll do my best to. It's really hard when I share my screen to see all of you. So you might just have to like, yes.
I'll chuck
Alan,
in.
I know that voice.
Where do you see the gaps where some real research needs to be done in the next 5 years? What do you see as the priorities?
I think we have to continue to do research where we haven't done research yet. So again, only 1% of the research that we have so far is in Africa. We need more African studies. South America is another place where it's like almost not present. There is one meta summary that was done with Latin Americans, and that does include North Americans and South Americans and Central Americans. But when you look at it, there is a huge proportion that comes from North America. So even in a meta summary about Latin Americans, a huge portion of it is in North America. So we need to get to places that we haven't been. So I think that's one thing.
Which is fine, but we're all, well, the majority of us sitting here are in weird countries.
We are, which again is telling, right? And I think that is where I would say we need to make sure that we're making contributions. So I've really tried to make an effort. I've been doing a bunch of research with Marcos in Bolivia. And one of the things that he's doing that I think is really monumental is he's having solution-focused conversations with indigenous Bolivians. So he's gone to 3 different communities and has said, and had solution-focused conversations with them. And one of the things that he is really realizing and holding on to is that, and again, I think this has implications for that miracle idea, they really emphasize hope. They say, I have hope for this. I have hope for that. We are hopeful that such and such will happen. And I think just realizing that when we ask, what are your best hopes? That fits really nicely for them. But sometimes then we as clinicians drop it. And we just go on with whatever they tell us their best hope is. But for these indigenous populations, they're saying hope is something that should be ingrained throughout. And I think we as weird country residents could really benefit from saying there's something useful in weaving hope throughout this entire process and not just letting it fall off. And so I think we can learn things from places where we haven't done a lot of research, and we need to go out of our way to try to collaborate to figure out how do we get that. So I think that's one. The other part of what I would say to you is we need to do research. I have the outcomes from outcome research. When we give these measures, what do the measures say? And I can tell you what the process research is saying. We have very, very little research that is mixing the two. When we do this process, what difference does that make to the outcome? And one of the places that I would say that's really relevant for us is that there's an entire conversation that's happening within the solution-focused community that we need to understand a bit more from an empirical place, which is this whole debate, whether you like it or not, of 1.0 versus 2.0. Does doing 1.0 solution-focused therapy make a difference in outcomes? Does doing 2.0 therapy make a difference to outcomes? We have to study, does the process, 1.0 or 2.0, change the outcomes? Right now, we are very good at saying solution-focused brief therapy works, but we don't know what about solution-focused brief therapy is making those outcomes present. So I think that's where we need to get really good research in the next 5 years. Any other questions so far? Okay. I'm gonna go back to this. Share. Can you see my screen?
Adam, I
Do you
see a question in the chat.
What, can you tell me what's the question in the chat?
So someone has put in light of the cultural discrepancies mentioned, have studies weighed the tomorrow question versus the miracle question?
Good question. And thank you for reading that to me. Apparently there are too many things for me to pay attention to all at the same time. No, not that I know of. I don't know of a single study that looks at the difference between the miracle question and the tomorrow question. There might be one. I just don't know about it. Any other questions that I'm missing so far?
That's all I see.
Thank you. Thank you for helping me. Okay, I'm gonna go back to the PowerPoint. Okay, can you see that now? All right, so here then is the process research. Again, I just explained these top bullets, which are what is process research? It's looking at what's happening in the room. So it helps us to understand how we're getting to the outcomes. But again, I think we have a huge way to go in this. So the biggest study that I know of that I can find that looks at all of the process research was done in 2017. So we probably need an update of this study because now we're getting, what, 7 years from this. But you can see there are some things that all of the process research highlights. And one is that focusing on strengths and resources tends to be the thing that people say is correlated to the most positive outcomes. And again, think about that. When you help people to feel hope, when you help people to feel inspired, when you help people to feel motivated by talking about their strengths and resources, then they say this worked, right? In addition, they highlighted the linguistic techniques and the collaborative language. We already highlighted this a little bit too. When we ask the miracle question, their language needs to be present in it. We need to be collaborating with them. They need to hear themselves in our questions, and that seems to contribute to positive outcomes. When we use purposeful language in the form of co-construction, and particularly the co-construction of meaning. So this is one thing I would say sometimes gets misinterpreted. Steve DeSazer used to say all the time, we stay on the surface. And I think there is something valuable about that. But if we don't co-construct what the differences mean, then we might leave some change on the table. People might not internalize as much what can be different if we don't construct meaning. What do these changes mean? And then, in addition, there's small positive results for the therapeutic relationship and therapist style. So if you are engaging, if you can connect with people, this is a common finding across all therapy. It doesn't matter what kind of therapy you do. If you can create a good therapeutic relationship, if you're an engaging kind of person, people want to contribute to this process. There's a little bit more about this. And again, there's the one microanalysis study that they mentioned in 2022 was luckily a study I know about because that was the study I did. And we looked at presuppositions. We looked at the difference between 1.0 presuppositions and 2.0 presuppositions. We don't have time for me to go into all of this. If you want to know about it, reach out to me. I'm happy to talk about it. But one thing that I would say is, to my knowledge, this study, this microanalysis study, is the only study that I know of that has looked at 1.0 versus 2.0. And it was done in 2022. It was too long ago. We should have a bunch of research by now to say, is what we're doing effective? If we do 1.0, if we do 2.0, if we do other things, if we integrate other things, does it make a difference? And that's not a question that we're asking. I just want to highlight a couple of things. Do not get overwhelmed with this chart. This is from that presupposition study. You can see we did a microanalysis of 3 1.0 therapists, Steve, Insu, and Yvonne, and 3 2.0 therapists, Chris Iveson, Evan George, Elliot Connie. We looked specifically at presuppositions. The reason that we did that is because in Mark McCurgo's paper, he said, here are the differences between 1.0 and 2.0. One, they include basically differences in their language. 2, 1.0 is more action-oriented. What are you going to do? What's the first step, right? And 2.0 contains more linguistic content about people who are close to them. So he laid out those differences in his paper, and we said, can we see those things show up in the language? I just want to highlight this thing here. If you look at presuppositions, 1.0 therapists use them about 20% of the time they speak, whereas 2.0 therapists use them 50% of the time they speak. If you look at this part here, conditional presuppositions at the very end, conditional presuppositions basically say, when this condition is in place, can you answer my question now? So I'm going to put it back into context of the miracle. If a miracle were to happen tomorrow, what would be the first thing you would notice? The condition is a miracle happened. The answer is conditional upon that condition being present. You can see that in 1.0, they only use conditional presuppositions 24% of the time. That's not 24% of their speaking turns. That's 24% of their total presuppositions, which means now we're at about 5% of their speaking time. They're using these conditional presuppositions. Whereas 2.0 therapists are asking these conditional presuppositions 80% of the time. So there's something qualitatively different about the language that's being used. I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm just saying we better know, does it make a difference? And right now, we don't know. And so one of the things, that's Alan, that's one of the reasons I answered the question, and the way I answered the question is because there's something inherently different happening here, and we don't know if it makes a difference. But we should know that. In addition, the interactional, so again, remember they said 2.0 therapists would be more interactional. They'll ask about other people in their lives. You can see that 1.0 therapists asked about that 29% of the time, whereas 2.0 therapists asked about that 62% of the time. Now, I want to say over here, 1.0 therapists asked about, collectively, they asked about 18 different people. And 2.0 therapists asked only about 19 different people. So the number of people they're asking about doesn't really change that much. What changes is how many times they ask about it, how many questions include other people. Again, does that make a difference to outcomes? We don't know, but we should know. And then finally, the other thing that I was going to highlight about this is the action-oriented. Again, what would you do differently? What would need to happen? What's the first step? You can see 1.0 therapists asked about that 24% of the time, and 2.0 therapists only asked about that 8% of the time, which again makes sense because 2.0 therapists are saying it's all about description. We're just describing the presence of the desired outcome. Does that make a difference to outcomes? We don't know, but we should know. So one of the things that we do know is that what Mark laid out as the differences, we can see those differences linguistically, but we don't know if they make a difference to outcomes, which is what we should be paying attention to now. So one of the things, the arguments that I'm making is we need to know not only what we do, but we need to know if what we do makes a difference. And so that's, I think, where the research needs to go. All right, I just have a couple of quick things that I'm going to orient your attention to. There are now 3 different treatment manuals. If you're going to do research, you should orient your research around one of these treatment manuals or another treatment manual if you have one. But they are available and they say, this is how you do this approach. If you can stick to it, if it's what they call fidelity, the more fidelity you have in your research, the higher the quality it is. So you can use the Diamond treatment manual, you can use the Brief treatment manual, or you can use the Solution Focused Brief Therapy Association treatment manual. Those will help you to can maintain a high level of fidelity. In addition, if you're trying to just stay up on research, I hate that I do this, but I do this for my job. And every month I do a YouTube video about a research piece. I take one study, I break it down for you, I try to make it as user-friendly as possible, and I say, here's a recent study that's been done, here's what it means. So if you just want to stay up to date on what the research is one time a month, this is a place where you can get that. If you're looking for research, we have tried to put together a database, a searchable database where you can go in and you can say, what research has been done on this? Now, what I'm going to say is give me a minute, because 2023 and 2024, I haven't put in yet. I'm in the middle of doing it. So as you go, it'll be updated. If you find a study and it's not in the database, send it to me and I will make sure it gets there. So this is not supposed to be, well, ultimately, we want it to be an all-inclusive search for any piece of solution-focused literature. But right now, we're just in the building stage. So if you know of an article and you don't see it in there when you search, send it to me and I will put it in there, and then it'll be in there, and then we'll all have access to it. The other thing that we're trying to do here is put in the researchers' email addresses. The reason that we're trying to do that is because oftentimes you'll hit a paywall. You'll try to go get an article and it'll say you have to pay $140 in order to get access to this article. The author can send you an individual copy and they can send it to you for free. But the only way you can get that is if you know what their email address is. So in this searchable database, we're trying to connect as many email addresses as we can so that you can get as many of these studies as possible. So any solution-focused literature you know about, send it to me if it's not there, and I will make sure that it gets there. And then the last thing that I want to just talk about is research that's coming. I'm doing EEG research with Rachel and with Mia. We're trying to now connect what happens in someone's brain when they get solution-focused brief therapy. How does that make a difference? And then in addition to that, the Solution Focused Universe has an AI training tool where you can go in and you can have sessions with AI clients. And we're tracking now people who are using this training model and saying, does it increase your confidence? Does it increase your ability to navigate difficult situations? So if you're interested in becoming a beta tester for this AI training tool, let me know and I'll see what I can do to get you in as a beta tester. And then finally, here are the references that I talked about. This is the Beta Box study, all of those studies. So those are the resources that you might need. All right. I know that was like a whirlwind. Any questions now? All right. I see a couple in the chat. Considering the distribution of weird to non-weird countries, any of these mixed? So research is conducted in weird countries, but participants from non-weird countries. No, they categorize them by where the participants are. So it's done on what the sample was, not who the researchers are. So that's the answer to that question. And then the next question, is there any research done to use the solution-focused approach in major conflict negotiation? That I don't know off the top of my head. I imagine yes, because there's a lot of research that's been done in the executive coaching and the business world, but that's not my expertise. So I don't keep up on it very well. So my recommendation is ask Mark McCurgo, because he's a good researcher and he's in the business world. All right, Kathy, nice to see you.
Hi. Hey, Adam. I suppose it struck me as you were speaking that it's almost incumbent on each individual in the field to try and build something towards the research database, because that's the evidence that's being required. And I wondered whether there's anything any of us individually can be doing that would be simple and that we could do through our practice. And I say this as someone who's not actively practicing at the moment, but is there anything that we could individually do that would somehow provide some evidence that's going to really build things up, as distinct from being involved in a big research project or relying on the researchers out there to do everything for us? Because I feel it's incumbent on all of us, but I think sometimes we're not even sure quite where to start or what we can do that's remotely helpful. But it's that practice-based research that maybe is going to be the key to building some stuff up. What do you think about that?
Okay, Kathy, you're my favorite person in the whole world, because you just said every clinician should be a researcher, and I absolutely agree with you. So there's two things that I would say is, one, whenever possible, and I know this is scary to a lot of people, record what you do. Again, think about my answer, which was we need to connect the process to the outcome. We need to know what happens in the room, and we need to know, does it make a difference? So whenever you can, record your interactions. Audio recording is okay. Video recording is way better. So that's one thing I would say. The second thing I would say is think about what you want to know about your own practice. If I do this, just think about that idea of the miracle question, right? And it now being somewhat inconclusive. Does it help? Does it not? You can pay attention to your work. You can give your client one simple question survey, and you can say, when I asked the miracle question, did it help or not? Or what was the most helpful thing about the work that we did? So you can just start asking your clients, tell me what worked. So then we can start collecting all of those what works, and we can say, generally, this is what works. The other thing I would say is, if you just pay attention to what you want to know, how do I reduce the number of sessions? Right? Then the people who come for 1 session, 2 sessions, 3 sessions and say, I'm done, you just ask them, what made the difference? Why did you finish so quickly? And they'll start telling you, oh, when you did this, or when this happened, or when we talked about this, that's the thing that unlocked. Then you can try that thing with other people. And then you can say, did that make their number of sessions go down? So you just have to think about, what do you want to know about your practice? And then try to answer that one thing. The other thing that I would say is, we're currently, and I'm going to throw Rachel under the bus. Really, I'm throwing me under the bus, because what we're doing is we're putting together what we're calling a global database. And I have let it fall because I've been too busy, but I'm coming back to Rachel because she was helping me with it. And what we are trying to do is exactly what you're saying. Get individual practitioners wherever they are in the world to submit their data to us to say, can you give your clients these measures? And then can you just track, are they getting better or not? And then we'll start collecting it all. And we'll say, how are we doing as a global community? So we are on the cusp of having that database ready and prepared. So the other thing I would say to your answer is, when I send out an email and I say, who can contribute to this? Everyone should raise their hand and be like, I will contribute to that. because then we will do all the work of saying, here's what difference you're making. We will track each of you individually, and then we will be able to collate, like I know you're in Australia, we'll be able to collate all of the Australian clinicians, and we can say, here's how Australia is doing collectively.
Mm-hmm.
So
terrific. Thanks, Adam.
So we're on the cusp of that.
Sure. Thank you.
You bet. Linda.
Hi. I think it's very related to Kathy's question, but I guess mine's sort of more if you're working in a setting where maybe SF is kind of not the predominant therapeutic approach, and you're in a situation where you're hoping to demonstrate to your manager that actually it's quite effective. I suppose I was wondering if there are any kind of outcome measures that you might recommend that you look at in terms of, your pre and post delivery of SF, and how then just wondered if there are any kind of reliable or valid measures that people use.
The easiest measure that was designed for that specific tracking over time is what they call the ORS-SRS. The outcome rating scale is on one side and the session rating scale is on the other side. Basically, it's a 4-question thing on each side. You rate 1 out of 10. They mark on there how they feel when they walk into the room and how effective the session was at the end of the session. And then you track that over time. You should be able to see a steady increase if therapy is going well. So that's something very easy to show your employer, to say, I've been doing this, I've been asking my clients these questions, here's what they tell me.
Okay, thank you.
You bet. All right, and I hope I say your name right, Nalusha?
Yes, perfect. Having a bad hair day, so with the recording and all, but anyways, I am curious if there's any research just around the impact of using solution focus on the clinician in terms of burnout levels, moral distress compared to other types of therapies or modalities.
As far as I know, there aren't any formal studies that do that, and I'll tell you one reason why that may be. Because in essence, you would have to have 2 groups, one solution-focused clinicians and one non-solution-focused clinicians. And people are very hesitant, especially if they work at agencies, to say, I'm not happy. Because then their bosses know, or maybe they get fired, or maybe they feel like they're not doing quality work, or those kinds of things. And so you have to have 2 groups who are willing to say, I'm not happy. So that's one thing. The other thing is, you would have to do that like approach by approach. So you would have to do solution focus versus narrative, solution focus versus CBT, so in order to have an equal, fair comparison. Because solution focus versus every other clinician doesn't give you a very specific answer. It just says, maybe we're better than some, but we don't really know who those people are or what difference it makes. So you would have to have a huge sample of the other group in order to make that comparison, which is hard to do. So I don't know of any. Anecdotally, solution-focused brief therapy people say they are happier.
Yeah.
But again, that hasn't really been collected in a mechanistic way.
Mm-hmm. And I guess would there be any value in looking at when people do switch over, like kind of their experience before and after?
Would there be utility? I think yes, absolutely there would be utility, because you'd be able to say like, this has made a difference or not. So if that's a study you can do, please do it, because yes, I think it would be useful.
Yeah, and I think to Linda's point too, like I think within organizations, I think because a lot of organizations now are looking at their workforce burnout and their workforce mental health, right? And ways that they can support that. And so sometimes it's this type of thing that could be supporting the workforce.
Absolutely. So you could do a study of getting a measure of their burnout at the beginning of the training, introduce solution-focused measures, and then do various follow-ups. Immediately follow-up, 1-month follow-up, 6-month follow-up, see if their burnout has changed over time after introducing solution. That would be a relatively easy thing to do in a business setting like that, because you can control, this is the one thing we changed.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, because we're doing a little bit
yeah.
of that within our
Right,
organization, but nothing published or publishable kind of thing.
yes, not yet. You're the
Mhm.
trailblazer.
Mhm.
You're gonna publish it. All
Yeah.
right. I just want to acknowledge, I know we're over time. If you need to leave, feel free to leave. I'll stay here and answer the questions as long as I need to stay here and answer the questions. Pout, I see your hand.
Yes, I really resonate with what Nalusha was saying. We were talking about this topic in my presentation an hour earlier, and then I seem to remember that there was a study on burnout, and Katia Hankowski gave me Antonio Medina and Mark Bayebach, 2014. I put it in the chat, so that could be
Good.
interesting to check out. And I was talking
You
to
were
the
right.
people who do research on training, and we touched on this exact same topic, that it would be so useful to measure this for people in organizations. So we're going to talk more at the conference in Essex, and who knows, we can make it work together with Nalusha. So yeah, this
good.
is a great topic. Yeah, brilliant. Thanks.
Good, good. Awesome. And it looks like Erica put a link to the same article. So
Brilliant.
in the chat.
Even better.
Anything else that we need to make sure to get to? Okay. All right. Well, then I'll just say thanks for being here. Thanks for enduring. Hey, Paul. Oh, Paul, is that a question or is that a hello to me?
It's both. I was just slow to get the technology working. I'm glad there is that research on burnout that's slightly higher level, perhaps, than anecdotal, because we say it all the time without any knowledge of having supporting evidence for it, that it's more enjoyable, takes less time, and there's less burnout for the. It makes sense that there would be, because you're asking people about things that they tend to enjoy talking about, their resources, their desires, their successes, and we're enjoying it along with them and not working very hard.
Yeah.
And
I think one of the, thank you, Paul. Nice to see you. One of the things I think that's the corollary is that in the therapeutic world is we talk about secondary trauma versus secondary resilience, right? And I think that's the same kind of a thing that you're getting at in the business world, perhaps, hopefully not trauma in the business world. But I think oftentimes hearing these things or being involved in a toxic environment or those kinds of things can create burnout. Whereas if we change the environmental factors, does that then create a difference? And so I think that literature is something worth drawing on when you're thinking about that prospect of how do they measure that kind of stuff. Yeah. Okay. Well, then with that, I'll just say thank you again. I know this is the end. Speaking of burnout, you might be there at this point. But hopefully that was helpful. I know that was a whirlwind. I know I've sent tons of things your way. If you have questions, just get a hold of me. I'm happy to talk with you about it. If you need me to point you closer to any of these things that I pointed out, just let me know. But thanks for being here, and I hope the rest of this event is good for you.
Thank you. Adam, can I just ask you to just hang on for 1 second? Because I want to just get Pout's email if she's willing to share. I sent her a direct message, but but once we close down, I won't be able to get that. So
I
if
will
we
be
can...
happy to wait. Yes.
And also want to say perfect. Thank you, Pout. That was amazing. That was really a great session. I really appreciate it. Very interesting.
Thank you. And thank you for helping me keep track of the chat.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Okay, well, and I'll reach out. Thank you. Bye.
Absolutely.
See you around.
Absolutely. Good to see you, Pout.